The fairy arrives in style, as a new character race option in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight adventure book, which dropped into stores and virtual marketplaces near you. Welcome back to the Wintry Wyvern. Let's go over these new winged friends of the Feywild. Originally appearing in the Folk of the Feywild UA article back in March, the fairy appears alongside the Heron Gun as the newest addition to D&D's playable roster. It's gone through a couple of changes, but we'll get to those soon enough. The word fairies is usually a catch-all term for many of the residents of the Feywild realm. It includes the familiar pixies and sprites, as well as brownies and redcaps and plenty of others. While I'd love for someone to confirm this, the first instance of playable fairies I could find was in the Tall Tales of the Wee Folk supplement to D&D Basic, released in 1989. The fairies, or the fair folk, were believed to be partakers in endless merriment, protectors of the woodsy wilds, and frequent meddlers in mortal affairs. The supplement provided options to play as fairy folk like the pixies, sprites, and brownies, as well as more curious choices like dryads, treants, centaurs, leprechauns, and the shahau, owl-like philosophers that may very well be the predecessors to the owl folk race, found in the same Unearthed Arcana from March of this year. The new fairy in Witchlight is very much intended to be a catch-all character option. While they do say most fairies have elven appearances, they're certainly not limited to it. This race is designed to capture the near-infinite variations of fairy kind, which means as long as you're small-sized and have wings, you'll more than likely fit right in. They do offer a table that gives you ideas on how you can look, from feathered wings to insectoid legs. My favorite is the smell of fresh brownies, which is a callback of course to the fey creatures called brownies, found in the first monster manual back in 1977, as well as old Scottish folklore. It's time to get used to the new Tasha-inspired design models for races, because they're here to stay. Modular ability scores for all future races, including this one, which means a +2 to one stat and a +1 to another, or 3 points split between 3 stats, making the fairy and all of its successors flexible into any build and any class. They'll learn a common tongue +1 language of your choice, which might be Elvish, Goblin, or Sylvan if you want to stay true to your Feywild origins. Just like centaurs and satyrs, all fairies are considered fey. This mechanically means you're not humanoid, which means a good handful of charm spells like Charm, Hold, and Dominate Person don't work on you. It does mean you'll be affected by spells like Hallow, Forbiddance, and Temple of the Gods, which are usually used to keep foreign threats out. Your size small, which is usually a downside. Heavy weapons are wielded at disadvantage, and you won't be able to grapple large creatures. But you can ride medium-sized mounts and slip through spaces as small as 2.5 feet wide, as well as through the spaces of large or larger creatures, treating them instead as difficult terrain. You have an average walking speed of 30 feet, and Fairy Flight, which gives you a flight speed that always matches that walk speed, even if it grows as you level. This fly speed is off limits if you're wearing medium or heavy armor, which matches the restriction that also exists on an Aarakocra's flight. The only other flying race, the Winged Tiefling with a flat 30 feet fly speed, only has a restriction on heavy armor. I guess you might think that's weird that the Tiefling's flight allows medium armor while the Fairy's doesn't, but you also have to remember that the Fairy's fly speed can grow higher through boosts to walking speed, making its top speed as high or higher than an Aarakocra with the right build. There's that, and it is a small race, so thematically medium armor might be considered too heavy for it. The Unearthed Arcana version had no armor limitations and allowed hovering, which bypasses a rule that makes flying creatures fall if they're knocked prone. This would have objectively been the strongest flight in the game if the fairy manages to reach Aarakocra speeds, and Jeremy Crawford, the head rules designer of D&D, is on record saying that they were well aware this was all busted.
We went through, in the Unearthed Arcana process, different versions of the flight. We experimented with a much more powerful version of flight than that ends up in the book, where you could hover. Playtesters rightly pointed out that that was way too powerful. We knew it when we sent it out in Unearthed Arcana. We often send things out that we know are overpowered, but we're curious to see what does the community think.
The fairy's final feature is Fairy Magic. It teaches you the Druidcraft cantrip, which is awesome, as well as the aptly themed Fairy Fire spell at 3rd level. At 5th, you get Enlarge Reduce, which is the replacement to the scrapped Fey Passage feature. Fey Passage in the UA would let you slip through spaces as narrow as an inch wide, which opens up a lot of difficult questions about creature size while slipping, or entering places in both non-living and living entities that I'd rather not address. Enlarge Reduce lets you take on a tiny size, much like your sprite and pixie cousins, or a medium size to stand among your normal-sized companions with a cozy boost to weapon damage. Fairies gain the benefit of being designed in 2021 in that race feature spells have the flexibility of choosing intelligence, wisdom, or charisma as their spellcasting trait. They're also added to your list of known spells that can be recast using spell slots, if once a long rest isn't enough for you. Older races don't have these luxuries, but it is definitely a welcome design change. With all that said, let's talk builds. There are unique up and downs to playing a fairy that we should keep in mind. In the pros column, it's a flying race from level 1, allowing it to easily challenge all landlocked threats. Its Fey typing dodges a handful of dangerous charm spells, and its natural spell list gives a source of advantage for classes that might not get spells naturally. In the downsides column, its small stature limits the martial weapons you're capable of wielding well, all but barring you from the heaviest hitters. It also puts you at a disadvantage in grappling scenarios, which is another detriment to strength-based builds. Funnily enough, the first build I'd suggest is a goofy one. Rune Knight Fighter allows the fairy to be one of 2 races that can grow to huge size without any spellcaster levels, the other race being the Duergar Dwarf. Use a bonus action to activate the Rune Knight's Giant Might feature, growing to large, and then cast Enlarge Reduce on yourself to grow to huge. If not the most effective strategy, it's certainly a sight to see that lets you handle those heavy weapons with no problem at all, for all of a minute. Fairies make awesome monks. With unarmored defense and unarmored movement, their fly speeds get faster and faster as you level, with no worry towards your armor class, and almost no worry to fall damage thanks to slow fall. Fairy Fire gives you the chance to gain advantage on your attacks, making it easier to land those stunning strikes. I'd recommend Barbarian too, with some caveats. Unarmored defense and fast movement does net you similar boons as the monk to your fly speed, but without heavy weapons your damage dice are gonna take a hit. If anything, I'd do it for the visual, honestly. A really angry fairy zipping around the battlefield sounds like a fun time. All in all, the fly speed is the main appeal of the fairy. Every class, especially long-ranged attackers, benefits from the mobility and safety of flight, especially at the very early levels. If you don't care too much about being small, the fairy's got more than enough going for it to fit into the most optimal of builds. And before we wrap this up, let's take a good look at what's changed since the Unearthed Arcana. Lore-wise, they've got a couple more details on their native languages. The base description does now say that most fairies look like insect-winged elves, but there's a couple of new optional aesthetics on the variation table. Bird wings are now listed as an option, as well as insect legs instead of the perpetually clean hands. The biggest changes to the features are of course the loss of Fey passage, and the changes to fairy flight, removing the wingless option, the hover, and adding an armor limitation, which I think were all necessary changes for balance reasons. For those already playing fairies in campaigns, run it by your DM if they're still cool with letting you keep your heavy armor builds, as that was apparently always intended to be removed. All in all, great. It doesn't rock the boat of race balance like the UA did, so I'm sure some people find it less exciting, but the DM in me is thankful for the humbling changes. They really tried to make the fairy a catch-all feyfolk template, so don't be afraid to go crazy on the aesthetics of your character because that was the entire intent of the open-ended description. I'd love for these templates for other creature types, but knowing what was taken from the Gothic lineages, which were the undead and the construct creature types, we're less likely to see them. Wild Beyond the Witchlight is out now. It sounds like an awesome adventure and a solid opportunity to try out the new Winged Friend. Until the next video, I'll see you guys around. May your feyfolk always be flying, your whims always wildly whimsical, and above all, stay frosty.